we've just been hearing about how social dialogue can help with worker engagement, but another group of stakeholders that it's really important to engage with are, of course, suppliers. And this session is all about how we can engage suppliers to ensure responsible recruitment. And I'm really glad that it's being led by somebody who many of you will know, Pink from Mars. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Well, good morning. It's still morning. So my name is Pink. I lead the work on human rights for Mars Pet Care. Very nice to see familiar faces around the room. Very excited to be here today with you all. Just to introduce briefly, Mars is part of a U.S. family business that we are leading work on producing pet care, food and services. So we are a principle-based company in which we are committed to ensuring that workers in our supply chain are recruited fairly, and also that workers do not have to pay to get a job to work for us, right? Our success in growing our business goes really hand in hand with supporting our suppliers to equip them with the skills and knowledge on how to identify, address, and prevent issues related to responsible recruitment. I think we've moved really beyond just merely supplier audits to more a longer-term engagement with our suppliers by incorporating worker voices, making sure that there's proper root cause analysis being incorporated and reflecting on longer-term interventions. In doing so, we very much believe that longer-term engagement with our supplier is the way forward to drive for sustained improvements and improve the livelihoods of workers in our supply chains. Very much glad that we are joined today. I would say three powerful ladies here on the stage with me. Today's session, we very much will be focusing on basically successful strategies that worked with supplier engagement and what lessons learned we have with working our suppliers. Today I'm going to be joined with hearing perspective from the brands, retailers, supplier, as also the international business consultancy who has been on the ground working with suppliers and addressing some of these very difficult challenges. I have with me Carola Calapini, Senior Manager for Sustainability Unilever, Arti Kapoor, Executive Director for uphold, and Lena Meleli, Sustainability and Human Rights Manager at Tadwin. Let me first start off with Carola with us here. Maybe you can share with us what is Unilever's approach to supplier capability building to ensure that your suppliers are adopting responsible recruitment practices?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Perhaps I can start by diving in straight into our supplier development program. The way we engage our supplier is quite straightforward. We have what we call a three-tier approach. So tier one is our full care program. This program really means that we engage with our supplier on a one-to-one basis. We work with, to take a step back, we do select implementation partner that work with us and help us towards the engagement with our suppliers. We select implementation partner also based on their local presence and knowledge of the local context. The implementation partner, we engage one-to-one basis with the supplier, and we work on a 6-7 stages approach. We do conduct a baseline assessment because we want to ensure that we really understand what are the areas of improvement and we address those areas. So how we baseline the supplier, how we really understand what are the needs is through management engagement, but also workers engagement. So we do face-to-face interviews as well, leverage technology and look at the different workers' voice tools. Once we have those results, we start to support the supplier to develop a corrective action plan where we work together with the supplier to identify those areas of improvement. And then we have a series of capacity building, again, engaging with the management, but as well with workers. And for this, again, we try to leverage technology as much we can. And moving to the impact assessment. So after the completion of the project, we wait around 6 months, and then we do an impact studies. because we want to really understand what are the impact on our intervention and what we have achieved. So obviously this is time consuming, expensive, and we have lots of suppliers. So we really need to leverage the data and select the priority supplier with who to engage. Tier number 2 is where we work with brands and we engage under a platform of in progress, and we do capacity building for a larger audience of suppliers. So we engage with other brands, with peers organization to really jointly do some capacity building work with our suppliers. And then we move on the light touch. The light touch, we try to identify, develop a toolkit, prevention toolkit, remediation toolkit. We update them as we go along, and we make those available to our suppliers. So in a nutshell, it's really a three-tier approach. And I would like to highlight how it is really important to engage with other brands, with peers organization. And I think the role that In Progress play here, it's really, really important because it allows us to come together and to identify common projects where we can work together.
Thanks, Carola. If I may ask a follow-up question, thanks for sharing the three-tier approach. I wanted to understand a bit more like, what is it like? Has there been challenges in terms of engaging suppliers to get their buy-in? Because oftentimes suppliers also feel like we're asking them beyond what goes between national legislation. So maybe you could share a little bit more how you got their supplier engagement to get them involved in your program.
Yes. So one very important thing is internal capacity building. So obviously our buyers, the procurement teams are on the front line. They own that relationship with the supplier. So really have that internal engagement. Is super important. So as you well know, so what we do recently, we had invited a retail organization, another peers organization to really come in within Unilever and explain what they are doing, because it's very important that also our internal team understand that the other companies are doing that. Our clients are doing that. So it's very important to create, it's very important that procurement really understand why we are doing this. They don't have to become human rights expert. They cannot, they don't have the time, but they really need to understand the business case behind it. So really ensuring that our colleagues understand why this is important, and integrating human rights KPI as part of the scorecard, I think it's a key driver to ensure that the message is cascaded down constantly.
Thanks, Carola. Let me shift to RT next to me. So very much very much pleased to hear about your work, that you're working with the communities and the local agencies in the previous sessions. Wanted to just touch base into, because Mars Petco also benefited from working with Uphold through the Ganapati initiative that really led to some of our suppliers to adopt the employer-based principle. Can you share a little bit more how that, as an implementer of the Ganapati initiative, how has that really driven adoption of responsive recruitment practices, and some of the lessons learned, and how maybe some around the room would actually be interested in participating in that initiative?
Thank you. So, go back one. So the Ganapati initiative is something that Uphold designed in response to a gap that we thought, that we understood after speaking to many supply chain businesses across Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, India, many other countries across Asia and also Africa. We noted that they didn't feel understood. They didn't really feel like their buyers were really understanding them when they were coming to them and saying, we want you to implement responsible recruitment standards. We want you to improve your labor standards. And as Pink was saying, asking them to go beyond national legislation. And I'm again going to quote my friend now, Shaila from SD Guthrie. When we spoke to the suppliers, they felt like it was a monologue, but coming from the other side, they didn't feel heard. So when we were working with AIM Progress's responsible recruitment working group, we shared this with them. And so they agreed to, and the members here contributed to the pilot of Ganapati, where what we do is we actually engage directly with supply chain businesses, one-on-one. So we're actually working with them, again, face-to-face, on the ground, for a period of at least a year, where we sit with them. We actually sign a confidentiality agreement with them, even though the commissioning client is their buyer. And then we actually work with them for up to a year to ask them, first of all, what are the areas you want to improve on labor standards? And then how do you want to improve on them? Technical coaching, training, reviews of policies, implementation of policies into procedures, what kinds of tools. And of course, a lot of it is in the informal work that we do with the suppliers, where they're actually talking about, our buyers aren't listening to us. They did an audit and we've got a non-compliance because they're asking us to repay back, all these fees. But that was before our policy came into place. Or they might say, how do we calculate how much fees to pay back? We don't know where to start. Who do we believe? Who don't we believe? How should we be working with our recruitment agencies? And they're coming to us with, once they trust us, they come to us with all of these questions. And it's like, whoa, let's just go one step at a time. So over the last couple of years, we've actually worked with over 24 suppliers. We've worked on 346 policies and handbooks. The number of suppliers we've coached and given training to just went up to 115 now, because last week we had a fantastic supplier event online, and we've hopefully impacted over 125,000 workers, and we've even designed tools for some of the suppliers. And what we're doing is we're working in the national language, we're working in the national context, we understand their challenges, and we're not pushing them to do anything that they don't agree to do. We work collaboratively, confidentially, and consultatively. So that's how we're working.
Arti, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Can you deep dive a little bit more? I'm trying to understand, compared for maybe smaller size suppliers, what has been the biggest challenge for them to getting started or even adopting, understanding that response to recruit? What's involved?
Yeah, there's a big difference between, that's a fantastic question. There's a big difference between a supply chain business that has 100 to 200 workers, or a supply chain business that has, 20,000, 25,000 workers. Very, very different. We have suppliers that fit those builds and even in between. So for a small or medium-sized enterprise, especially if they're young, like 10 years old, they actually don't have yet in place policies and procedures. Everything works informally. It doesn't mean that they don't have ways of working, but they don't have the written documents in place. So we work at that level. We work at policy level. We work at making statements, commitments. And then the good thing about those companies is we're working directly with the CEO or the family that owns the business. At a larger level, it becomes more about implementing, using tools to implement. So we're working in the formal space of operational development and also the informal space of corporate culture in many of these companies. System and operational development is both formal and informal, cultural and procedural.
Thanks, Arti. Let me move to Lena here. So Lena represents from Tadwin. Tadwin is, as we all know, they're a leading supplier of sustainable natural latex. Can you share a bit about what has successful engagement with supplier relations look like and what has really worked for your side? Maybe you can touch a little bit more on how basically are the buyers' brands making reasonable demands on you as a supplier, and what has worked in terms of building that relationship so far?
Thank you. So as Pink mentioned, I represent Tatwin. We're a SME manufacturer of natural rubber latex based in southern Thailand. And so we buy field latex from farmers, smallholders, usually via collection centres, and then the concentrated latex that we produce ends up in surgical gloves, household gloves, condoms, adhesives, garments, so on. I think I'll start by touching on our sustainability journey, which many of you might have already heard, but I think really does, as a case study, underline the importance of supplier engagement, buyer-supplier engagement, because about 6 or 7 years ago, a multi-stakeholder supplier engagement initiative led by IKEA at the time was looking into the value chain of one mattress range. And as part of that, identified Tatwin as a tier 5 supplier. Their focus at the time was on forced labor. And after that, they came on site. They worked to understand, to help us understand what the indicators of forced labor were, what we could put in place to then, prevent future cases, to remediate those effective. And I start there because I think it really highlights what the impact can be, but also like the ambition of trying where possible to go beyond that tier 1 layer, and actually maybe the impact of going more vertically into a supply chain rather than across all your tier 1. But in terms of what engagement looks a little bit more like for us today, that was probably quite an unusual case. So there's 3 main buckets really of how we're engaged by our buyers. The first is a kind of information extraction sort of approach, which was kind of touched on a bit earlier. Things like self-assessment questionnaires or supplier surveys where they're pretty lengthy, often quite duplicative, a lot of yes or no binary answers. Do you have this policy in place? Have you had instances of X, Y, and Z? And often you don't really have to provide evidence. So, it does create opportunities probably for a bit of retrofitting, especially if you're working in a dynamic where you're not so sure how your answer might actually then affect your working relationship. I'm not sure that should really fall into the bucket of engagement, but I think it probably does for a lot at the moment. The second is more information sharing approach. That's in the format often of kind of one-to-one, sort of large online information sessions. Bit one-directional. There might be a new code of conduct in place, a new policy recommendation in place. It's often a Zoom call filled with dozens, if not hundreds of cameras off. They can be quite efficient and effective in getting a lot of information across, I do think. But as far as knowing that you're mobilizing action on responsible recruitment, on responsible business conduct, I'm not sure quite how far they go. And then, so the third bucket is probably more of an information exchange, a dialogue that they start. It can build off something like an online session and then translate into a series of one-to-one meetings or on-site buyer visits to our factory, or large in-person events as well. As you can probably tell, I think that is the third bucket. The third bucket does work, I think, in setting a much better tone. It's rather than a specific format, I think it is that ethos of exchange and 3 elements behind it, I think, which makes them so effective. One, that reciprocal dynamic, the buyer wanting to learn from us just as much as we want to learn from them, to understand what are the challenges we might have in place that are preventing, the obstacles from implementing particular policies. Of course, a lot of suppliers, a lot of SMEs will have shared issues, but I think getting to grips with what that specific supplier might be facing can surely be a much more effective way for the brand to also then tailor their work with you. Of course, there's effort involved, I'm sure, but a lot of time and resource. Then the second element is that when there's a more defined aim, a clear scope, I think that really helps us as suppliers to understand what we can bring to that interaction. With something like an SAQ and the teams that I work with to kind of complete those, you're just sending a lot of information out into the void often. And there's not a lot of feedback to know how that's used, what it really means for our relationship with our buyer. So I think that opening up a bit of a dialogue in terms of honesty and our team, my colleagues knowing what they might be able to get out of interaction or how they can prepare and be best placed to get something out of the following ones. And the final one is the long-term nature of them. the exchange-based learning approach opens up space for honesty and trust. You're not concerned that there might be a sort of zero tolerance approach, maybe, in that you're sort of, as a supplier, willing to bring much more of kind of your development learning journey onto the table. And I think that's where the kind of healthy dynamics with buyers kind of comes from.
Thanks, Lena. Thank you very much for sharing those insights. I had a follow-up question, and because you talked about, I think we're also as guilty as brands, are also introducing a lot of like Zoom calls that are one-directional. I'd be keen to hear a little bit more. How do you think we can improve the way those one-directional Zoom calls, are there basically focus areas that you would like us to focus a bit more to help you to facilitate your work?
It's a good, tricky question.
Is that a tricky question?
I think, well, we attended the Ganapati one the other day, and I think what was different about that one was the introduction of case studies and peers, and a bit more of that peer-to-peer learning, where you are hearing situations that other companies, other businesses are facing, and the comfort that that gives you, that, okay, yes, we're not alone. I think that is quite a well-cited sort of thing, but it makes a big difference. I also think that something that as suppliers operating in competitive markets, really tight margins, they're a bit more, sometimes that when calls have involved a little bit more of a recognition of what that landscape might look like, and considering those circumstances, maybe this is something, and alignment between when you know that multiple customers, multiple suppliers, buyers are sharing their priorities, and making that clear through those engagement sessions. And that is something that can come through an online information session. And, you know, I think it is when you know that a particular area is a priority for a buyer, that at least as many SMEs and suppliers experiences go, that can go quite far in mobilizing action, and potentially quite quickly. Because particularly when you're a small business, if you know that it makes business sense, it just can happen really rapidly.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm looking at the time. I would like to open up maybe some time for questions from the audience here, and then before we go into perhaps the key takeaways or recommendation or call to action here. Are there any questions that came in the poll?
Sorry, we have a few questions. The first one is, many workers in the world work in informal sector. They don't often have employment contracts, yet the services they provide are often crucial. So how can supplier engagement extend to this group? That's the first question. Capacity building is important, but brands also need to look at purchasing practices so suppliers can afford responsible recruitment and provide decent work without losing margins. How are brands looking at their own purchasing practices and how they incentivize responsible recruitment? Do you have time for one more? Yes. Can you provide specific examples on how improving policies translate into real change for workers?
Last question. I think the question was, how do you examples of policies translate into real action? I think that was the question. We have 3 sets of questions here. I don't know if anyone wants here to take us, respond to those questions. I think the first question is how supplier engagement can address work in the informal sector. The second one is really, have we looked into purchasing practices and incentives for suppliers to adopt responsibility? And the third question is really about, can you share examples of how translating policies into real action?
If I may. Sorry, I've got a bit sniffly because I ate 2 samosas in the lunch break and I'm gluten-free. So Yes. Oh, no. So I want to say something about informal work. I think that's an excellent question. We've been looking at this issue of informal workers in supply chains. And of course, the more is it upstream you go, the closer you go to the actual raw materials, the more informal work you find. Having worked on the ground in these countries, we're talking about Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, Vietnam, Philippines, Southeast Asia and Asia is developing, as you know, at a very fast rate. Development in these countries, what does that mean? It means formalization of systems. The registration of workers and people into the pension funds, the social funds, education systems, health systems. These are the parts of these countries that are developing. Now, why aren't these part of the social audits that are actually going on? The better you formalize workers in your tier 1, your tier 2, and your tier 3, the better they are actually plugged in to the developing systems, the economy of a country. Why are we focusing on very narrow issues of, just looking at forced labor? We can actually look at safe labor, formalized labor, regulated labor as a way of actually reducing risks of forced labor. So that's one thing I want to say, is that we could actually start looking at what we want to see in supply chains rather than what we don't want to see in supply chains. So my recommendation is social audits and standards should actually focus on aligning with the development trajectory of the countries where sourcing is happening.
Carola, you want to add anything on?
Maybe I can add a couple of words on how to translate the policy to action. And I think here is where the long-term engagement, as you mentioned earlier, it's coming in and moving away through to 1 day training, ticking the box and move away. So really, that's one-to-one engagement that also the same principle that the Ganapat is built on, that really understand the needs and support the suppliers, of course, build that policy and management system also through implementation. And I think the way that we are now assessing the impact of this kind of engagement after 6 months of the completion of the project, the aim is really to understand the impact and really ensure that changes have been happening and the impact on workers, because the way that we are measuring that impact is from workers' engagement at the beginning through a baseline assessment using digital solution, as well as at the end, after 6 months, again, engaging again with workers and see what was that impact. So that's, I think, we're trying to really ensure that policy has an impact.
You have anything, Lena, you would like to add on to any of the points?
Shall I add? I'll add a little bit onto the changing policy as well, and then maybe I'll touch on the purchasing practices, because I think that is a really interesting one. I think in terms of changing policy, I guess we have two hats, both as a supplier who we are engaged by our buyers, but we do engage our buyers too. And one thing that I think has been really important has been for working with each specific operational team in changing policy. So really a consultative approach internally within all the teams, but also coming back to the previous session, engaging with workers. So when we are reviewing grievance mechanisms, for example, we've driven with my colleague Tutu here in-person consulting sessions to co-develop, co-design, understand from workers what is working, what's not working. And then that actually allowed us to review the policy and recognize that actually some more informal channels, things like a line channel or different group chats, were essentially acting as grievance mechanisms. So yeah, in terms of changing policy, I think as far as possible, trying to get everybody on board and listening is just as important for us as suppliers who are, as buyers, doing the engaging as it is for us being engaged by our buyers. And I think, yeah, the second question that was on purchasing practices is something that we as suppliers really would echo, because sometimes we will be engaged by a sustainability and human rights team who are really on board, really encouraging us to make all these changes, adhere to certain standards. So we're bought in too. But then suddenly you're in a different conversation with a different team of the purchasing team, and you realize that that doesn't translate to essentially money that can purchase our product, or things that actually can make us really able to commit that time and resource because we know it translates to custom. So I think, yeah, we've definitely echoed that call for, I think you said, Carola, like alignment of KPIs. And it does maybe come down to KPIs where purchasing teams, procurement teams, introducing something for them that's aligned with the broader vision is important. But I'd be curious definitely to hear other perspectives on that.
Go ahead, Artie, before I go.
Thank you. I just wanted to add something on the purchasing practices topic. We, in collaboration with AIM Progress members, we actually consulted with a number of suppliers across India and Indonesia and Thailand. It was really hard to get suppliers to open up to us, even though it was confidential interviews. And we talked to them about their human rights due diligence and sustainability. And many things came out, and the report is going to be published. But I'll just mention two things on purchasing practices. First of all, many suppliers felt that sharing of the margin in profits was not fair enough, and that whilst buyers are, increasing prices based on costs of raw materials, they weren't sufficiently raising prices based on the cost of rising labor costs. And in countries like I've mentioned in Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, there are a lot of labor reforms going on. Minimum wages are increasing regionally and nationally, almost every year. And that's just minimum wage, not including social security and other contractual measures of labor reforms. Secondly, many suppliers raise the issue of payment terms. Some suppliers are experiencing up to 180 days before payment is made. And for small and medium-sized supply chain businesses, they feel that their buyers are taking credit on them, and they've got to make ends meet. Meanwhile, they have cash flow issues. So, for small and medium-sized businesses, we're recommending that buyers review payment terms and make sure they're paid earlier. So that's just a couple of things. A lot more to be said on that, but yes.
Let me just add also on the question from Mars' perspective on the purchasing practices. I think just 2 points. Basically, we do have a responsible sourcing guidelines that we expect our suppliers to source as per our policies. But also very important to this conversation is we do realize that we also expect our suppliers to adopt the employee pays principle. As a matter of fact, we want them to reflect that cost of recruitment should also be reflected in the cost of doing business as well. So in terms of understand, we also recognize that that because the cost is part of cost of doing business, suppliers should be applying a fair share modeling when they are actually doing contracts with us. And this is very much anchored with the way buyers like Mars are reflecting cost of recruitment into our contracts with suppliers. So just wanted to share that piece of information that, there is effort on the buyer side to basically reflect it part of doing business. The challenge, I think, for us is basically reflecting due diligence in the entire supply chain for reasons that we don't have full close connections with the lower tiers in supply chain. But I think there's efforts for us to try to incorporate that as part of purchasing practices. Okay, I realize there is down to 7 minutes, and I wanted to just perhaps, I don't know if there are any final questions, or are there more questions? Ask more questions before I go into the call to action and final recommendation. Maybe 1 or 2 more, and then we go into the panelists for the final last recommendations.
There's still some questions, but I think you've already answered through your discussion. One is, we see that ethical recruitment only succeeds when responsibility is shared across the supply chain. What have you seen that helps move suppliers from passive compliance to co-creation of ethical recruitment solutions? Would you like me to give you one more? Okay.
Maybe give it another question since we have 6 minutes.
How do you engage with suppliers that are reluctant or those who may not feel that they are concerned? And I'll give, and last question is, how can brands and suppliers extend the same policy and rights to both directly hired employees and those hired through the third-party agency?
Carol, yes.
Perhaps I can say a couple of words on engaging a supplier that are reluctant. Yes, that's come pretty often. And often what we hear back is, well, it's only Unilever asking us this, and this is a recurring statement, especially in the GCC, that is coming up quite a lot. So this is why, again, and I'll come back to the point I've already made several times, is the collaboration. That's really, it's essential and is key to showcase that it's not Unilever only asking for it, but there's many other brands. And plus those are international requirements, we don't come up with anything. So yes, so that's essential. And yes, we see a lot of that pushback, and I think the solution comes back to definitely brands collaboration, because that would allow us to, one, increase the leverage, showcase that those are international requirements, and of course also reduce cost, because working together would reduce the cost of that engagement.
Thanks, Carol. I don't know, Artie, do you want to cover on the issue or topic of co-creation because I think that's very much the principle behind the Ganapati and how that's has worked.
Yes, so maybe combining an answer for two of the questions around ethical recruitment or responsible recruitment and how you collaborate across tiers, buyers and suppliers, but also how do you extend ethical recruitment to temporary workers and not just employed workers. So all it is a decision and a willingness. That's all it takes, and an openness to listen to each other. What I mean by that is also to understand that responsible recruitment is of benefit to everybody. Responsible recruitment under our Ganapati program is not just about recruitment fees. That's a very important part of it, but we have 10 themes under Ganapati. And those 10 themes of responsible recruitment include contracting. They include pre-departure orientation, post-arrival orientation, training on the job, living and accommodation, gender and discrimination, grievance mechanisms and worker representation. So there's a whole list of 10 themes that responsible recruitment covers. So when we work with supply chain businesses, and this is what we also advise our clients, the buyers, the ones here listen and are actually implementing it. But what we're talking about is when you're talking with a supply chain business in Thailand or Malaysia, and they're not willing to take on employers' pays principle, first of all, just listen to where they do want to change, where they can change on responsible recruitment. Let's not get stuck just first of all on fees. We'll get to the fees. In a year's time, we'll get to the fees. But let's start with pre-departure orientation, renegotiating your contract with your recruitment agency, making sure contracts are reflective of the actual job. There is so much more that workers tell us that they want when they get recruited and when they're working, which is more than just one aspect of responsible recruitment. So let's not get fixated on one aspect, because the experience and the well-being of worker includes all of those things, including, worker engagement and social dialogue. And how do you make sure temporary workers are treated in the same with the same rights? Of course, it's just a decision. And then that supply chain business works with their contractor. They get included in everything. So it's a decision that gets made. Obviously, the outcome comes from a social audit or a rapid assessment or something like this. So, yeah.
So, thank you, Artie. Just wanted to say we're wrapping up the session right before, so we can have lunch. Perhaps maybe one final word for each to go around to say what are the key takeaways and any call to action for this group in particular.
Be a very practical call to action. We're planning some capacity building coming up in Malaysia pretty soon, Thailand as well. So if anyone is interested, please reach out to me.
Thank you. Lena.
I'll echo that call for collaboration. And if not quite collaboration, even alignment. And I know that each industry is a little bit different, but more conversation on what your standard is, your recommended practices, so that buyers aren't duplicating effort, because we know as suppliers that we attend three calls within a month on a similar topic. So collaboration and alignment would be a call to action from me.
Thank you. Artie.
So the Ganapati, what does Ganapati mean? Ganapati is another word for the Hindu mythological deity Ganesha, who is revered across South and Southeast Asia, the elephant-headed god. And that represents auspicious beginnings and the removing of obstacles. And that is for good recruitment, good employment, and good employer behavior and good relationships. So if you would like to understand a little bit more about how we work on Ganapati, please get in touch, whether you're a supply chain business, an NGO, or a buyer, multinational corporate. Thank you.
Thanks, Artie. Just wanted to say this, the beginning of our supplier-buyer engagement. I want to say that this is the beginning, and they will continue to strengthen that process. Thank you very much for everyone's attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Pink and the panel. What a great session, and brought us back to some of the last two sessions, brought us back to some of the very human elements of responsible recruitment. How does it impact on workers, and how does it impact on their lives? And then how does it impact on suppliers who are trying to deliver all of the requirements from the brands, but actually still make money in the place there. And Artie mentioned a number of additional things that brands can do, and of course length of contract is another thing that's important to suppliers, and that was the one thing that perhaps wasn't mentioned. It's now lunchtime here in Bangkok, and lunch will be served just outside in the lobby area. It's a standing lunch to encourage networking. We know, we saw earlier how interested everyone is in talking to each other. But for those of you who do wish to sit down and have your lunch, there's a room just off at the end of the corridor here, and you're also welcome to bring your lunch into this room as well. But as before, we need to start promptly on time at 2 p.m. So please be back by 2 p.m. But lunch is now served outside. Thank you.